in the watch community, the watch media, watch social media, there's always certain questions that kind of bubble around. Questions like, what is a homage? Should we have a homage? Questions like, one that's gone away a little bit is, what's a fashion watch? And should we buy fashion watches? That second question about fashion watches has largely gone away because if fashion watches aren't dead, they are very seriously ill. And what we tend to talk about now is the thing that made fashion watches sick, the smartwatch. And the new question, or one of the new questions that's constantly bubbling around in the watch zeitgeist is a smartwatch a watch at all? I've got a feeling, I've got more than a feeling actually, I've got an opinion on this. I'll tell you what it is after the intro. Okay, so before I go on, who am I? Why have I got an opinion on why should you listen to me? I'm Pete McConville. This is my channel. I talk about watches, but I tend to do it from a more philosophical, cultural, social, intellectual perspective. So I'll come at things from a slightly different and odd and overthinking point of view. If that sounds interesting, great. Like, subscribe, do all that sort of stuff, and we'll see each other more often. Okay, so really quickly, I'll come straight out of the gate and say I don't think a smartwatch is a watch, and I'll tell you why. I'm going to do something I don't like doing. It's a bit undergraduate, and that is starting a debate looking at dictionary definitions. And you're about to see very quickly the weakness of doing this. If you look up the definition of a wristwatch or a watch, it tends to say something along the lines of a timepiece worn on the wrist. That sounds like a slam dunk, except of course we have to now define what a timepiece is. If we look up the definition of a timepiece, it says it's a watch. So we've got a nicely circular argument there, haven't we? But it actually does say more than that. It says that a timepiece is something for telling the time. And that's really important. That definition doesn't say something that does tell the time, but something that's for telling the time. What's the difference between something that's for telling the time and something that does tell the time? Well, it's really simple. I'm talking to you through the lens of my Sony a7 III. If I was to spin that digital camera around, there's a time display. But if I was to describe that to you as I've bought my new clock, my Sony a7 III, you would laugh at me. You wouldn't know what I was talking about. It's clearly not for telling the time. It's not a clock. It's clearly a camera. It's for taking images. It just happens to tell the time. If I look down, I'm looking at my laptop. My laptop has a little time display in the corner. But if I was to say to you that I'm reading the notes of this speech or this presentation off the clock in front of me, you would laugh at me because it's clearly not a clock. It's a laptop. It's not there. It doesn't exist to tell me the time. It exists to do 1,000,001 other things, to game on, to write letters on, to write emails, to check Facebook and Instagram, to read my notes while I'm doing YouTube videos, maybe to show me the YouTube video back and to edit the YouTube video. That's what it's for. It just happens to also have a time display. If I walked into my kitchen, I could say the same thing about my fridge that has a time display on it. I could say the same thing about my oven, my microwave, and a whole bunch of other things. If I was to describe any one of those as a clock, you would quite rightfully laugh at me because they are not for telling the time. They are for refrigerating food, heating food, boiling water, whatever. That's what their defining characteristic is, and that's how we think of them. That they happen to be able to tell the time as well is nice, maybe assists in their primary purpose for being. In most cases doesn't, but it might. But it doesn't define them. If you walked into a shop that advertised itself as selling clocks, and all you saw was a wall of fridges with time displays, you would feel like something was wrong. Okay, all of that brings me now back to the smartwatch. And is the smartwatch a watch? And I would argue, no, it is not, because it's not for telling the time. A smartwatch is for a million other things that may or may not involve telling the time. It's for connecting to your phone. It's for collecting your heart rate. It's for having a GPS that can track your location. It's for having an accelerometer that can track your steps. On a very personal basis, how this plays out for me in my real life is the other morning I woke up, threw on some tracksuit pants, threw on a sweater, walked outside. My daughter was already sitting on the bed, on the couch. She called out, "Hey Dad, what's the time?" I immediately just turned to the Google Nest and said, "Hey Google, what time is it right now?" My daughter looked at me like I was a mad thing. Sorry, my phone just heard me say that. I should have turned that off. My daughter looked at me and said, "What are you doing? You're wearing a watch on your wrist." No, I wasn't. I was wearing, sorry, I just bumped the phone. I was wearing my Garmin. My Garmin, my smartwatch, is not a watch. I don't even think of it as a way of telling the time. I wear it all the time. It tracks my sleep, it tracks my exercise, it tracks my heart rate, but I never even think of it as a way of telling the time. If I'm not wearing my watch, this thing vanishes. I don't wear it the same way. I wear my watch low and loose and in a place that I can get to and see easily. I wear my smartwatch, or actually my Garmin, high and tight, where it can fit under a cuff. I never need to see it, and where I can feel it buzz if I've got a notification, and I've got a really good connection for the heart rate monitor. I was listening to a blog to watch, and Rick said something similar about his Apple Watch. He says he's got the Apple Watch, but primarily he wears it as a medical device to track parameters because of a medical condition he's got. If he didn't have that medical condition, he wouldn't wear the Apple Watch, in which case I'd say, mate, you're not wearing a watch, you're wearing a piece of medical equipment that has a time display. That it happens to have a time display does not define the purpose of that watch. Another way of putting it is, if you were to ask me, I've spoken many times on a lot of podcasts, and people say to me, "Pete, when did you get into watches?" And I'll say with complete honesty, it was sometime around 2015. I was getting ready for my 50th birthday in 2016. I was thinking that I would get into watches, blah, blah, blah. My first real watch, or my first expensive watch, was, a Frederic Constant Classic Index, and I'd go on with the story. And that is absolutely true. If you were to ask my wife or my daughters, when did I get into watches, they'd say something similar. It was only as I was thinking about this, I realized that is kind of germane to this discussion, because almost 10 years earlier, I had started buying Garmin watches or smartwatches or wearables or whatever language you want to talk about. I'd started with like a Garmin 310 XT, I think back in about 2008. I went up to, I've got it here still, a Garmin 510 in 2011, a Garmin 920 in I think I bought that in about 2014, 2015, and the Garmin Fenix 5X, or S, I think it is, that I'm wearing now, that I bought back in 2019. But I don't even, if you were to ask me theoretically, if those were watches, I would say that I got into watches way back in 2007, but that just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel true. I didn't buy these things as watches. I didn't wear them as watches. And I still don't wear my Garmin as a watch. It's something else. What is it? It's wearable tech. It's a fitness tracker, an activity tracker. It's a phone extension. It's a whole bunch of things. But it's not a watch. It's not for telling the time. Not only is it not for telling the time, it's not for any of the other reasons I wear a watch. I don't go to a red bar so I can show people my Garmin. I don't have a watch Instagram so I can show people my Garmin. In fact, there is not a single part of my life that I would define as involving watches, other than answering the occasional question, is my Garmin a watch, that has any intersection, any overlap, any connection with the idea of Garmins and watches being the same thing. Which brings me to my very personal position. Is a smartwatch a watch? Absolutely not. They have no overlap. They are two devices. One is a device whose sole purpose is to tell the time and is therefore a timepiece, and since it's worn on the wrist, is a wristwatch. The other is an electronic device whose purpose is to gather and track data, including which may or may not be the time, and is to connect me to my social media, to my training stats, to my health, and to a whole bunch of other things. The purpose of this of a smartwatch, of this Garmin, is not to tell the time. Therefore, it is not a timepiece. Therefore, it is not a watch. Anyway, I've been Pete McConville. This has been my very sort of philosophical view of why a smartwatch is absolutely positively not a watch. Over to you. Tell me in the comments what your position is. See you later. Bye.